By sunset on August 2nd, 216 before Christ, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers lay dead on a narrow Apulian plain beside the Aufidus River. It was the single deadliest day in the entire history of the Roman Republic, and it was engineered in roughly 6 hours by a man who was outnumbered almost 2 to 1. Here is the detail that sounds invented, but is documented by Livy himself. After the killing stopped, Carthaginian officers gathered the gold signet rings stripped from the fingers of fallen Roman knights and senators, filled measuring vessels with them, and shipped them across the Mediterranean to pour out before the Carthaginian Senate as proof of what had happened. Bushels of gold rings. Each one had belonged to a man who had ridden south that morning, believing he was part of an unstoppable force. Hannibal Barca was 31 years old. He had crossed the Alps, lost half his army to cold and rockfall, and then beaten Rome 3 times in succession. Now Rome had answered with the largest army it had ever assembled, 86,000 men under 2 consuls, and Hannibal had not run. He had chosen the ground, shaped the geometry, and waited. His cavalry commander Hannibal would reportedly tell him that evening that he knew how to win a victory, but not how to use one. Whether Hannibal was right is a question this film will chase all the way to its final moments. The question that drives everything you are about to witness is deceptively simple. How does an army of 50,000 encircle and destroy an army of 86,000? Not in theory, not on a diagram. On a real plain, with real dust, real wind, real men who could see the trap forming and still could not escape it. This is the full reconstruction. We begin not on the battlefield, but decades earlier, in the harbours of Carthage and the Senate halls of Rome, where the first war between these 2 powers ended in humiliation, indemnity, and an oath sworn by a 9-year-old boy who would spend the rest of his life keeping it. We trace the Barcid Empire built in Spain on silver and Iberian swords, the siege of Saguntum that made war inevitable, and the extraordinary decision to march an army over the highest mountains in Europe rather than risk the sea Rome controlled. We walk through the disasters at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene that shattered Roman confidence, and the agonizing political debate between Fabius, who counseled patience, and a Senate that demanded a decisive blow. We examine both war machines in detail, Rome's deep legionary formations, their allied contingents, the fatal system of alternating daily command between 2 consuls who disagreed on everything, and Hannibal's polyglot army of Numidian horsemen, Libyan veterans, Gallic and Spanish swordsmen, held together not by a common language, but by trust in one commander's mind. We study the terrain, the river that became a cage, the hot wind called the Volturnus that blew dust into Roman eyes. Then we enter the battle itself, phase by phase. The cavalry clash on both wings, the Roman infantry driving forward into a centre that bends inward exactly as Hannibal designed, the Libyan columns wheeling like closing doors, the cavalry returning to seal the rear, and the terrible compression that followed, when the greatest army in the Western world could no longer raise its weapons. What makes Cannae extraordinary is not simply the scale of destruction. It is that one afternoon on an Italian plain became the founding text of tactical encirclement for the next 2,000 years. Scipio Africanus studied it and mirrored its geometry at Zama to defeat Hannibal himself. Napoleon recognized its principles. The German General Staff built an entire war plan around it. commanders on every continent have measured their ambitions against what Hannibal achieved beside the Aufidus. And yet Hannibal never marched on Rome. The most perfect tactical victory in ancient history did not win the war. That paradox is as important as the battle itself, and we will follow it to its conclusion. If you value complete reconstructions of the battles that shaped civilizations, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Each time, we take one legendary clash and rebuild it from the first political spark to the last strategic consequence, move by move, decision by decision. Let us begin where this story truly begins, not on the sun-baked plain of Cannae, but in the burning wreckage of a war that ended 25 years earlier and left one family with a hatred they would carry across mountains. In the year 264 before Christ, two powers that had coexisted for generations stumbled into a war neither fully intended, over an island neither could afford to share. Sicily, the largest landmass in the Mediterranean, sat precisely between them, Rome expanding southward through the Italian peninsula, Carthage projecting naval dominance from its magnificent harbor on the North African coast. For over a century, treaties had kept the peace. Now a local dispute among Sicilian mercenaries dragged both into a conflict that would last 23 years, consume hundreds of thousands of lives, and leave one side burning with a hatred that time would never cool. Carthage entered the war as the supreme naval power of the Western Mediterranean. Its circular military harbor at the heart of the city could shelter 200 warships. Its merchant fleet connected Spain, Sardinia, and the African coast in a web of silver, tin, and grain. Rome possessed no battle fleet at all. Yet Rome did something Carthage never anticipated. It built one. According to Polybius, the Romans reverse-engineered a captured Carthaginian quinquereme, constructed over 100 copies in 60 days, and trained crews on rowing frames built on dry land. The detail may carry exaggeration, but the core fact stands confirmed by the war's trajectory. Within 2 years, Rome was contesting Carthaginian supremacy at sea. The war ground on across Sicily's coastal fortresses and open waters. Rome won shattering naval victories at Maele and Ecnomus, then overreached with an invasion of Africa under Regulus that ended in catastrophic defeat. Carthage clawed back control of the sea, then lost it again. By 241, both states were financially exhausted. Carthage sued for terms. The treaty stripped her of Sicily entirely, imposed an indemnity of 3,200 talents payable over 10 years, and forbade Carthaginian warships from Italian waters. For a mercantile empire built on maritime control, the terms were a slow strangulation. Then came the wound within the wound. Carthage's own unpaid mercenaries, 20,000 veterans ferried home from Sicily, revolted when the Senate delayed their wages. The resulting conflict, remembered as the Truculus War, nearly destroyed Carthage itself. It was Hannibal Barca, the undefeated commander from Sicily's final campaigns, who crushed the rebellion through 3 years of brutal fighting. He emerged as the most powerful man in Carthage and the most dangerous. Polybius records that Hamilcar believed the war with Rome had been lost, not on the battlefield, but by Carthage's political class. He would not forgive. He would not forget. Hamilcar turned west to Spain. Beginning around 237, he carved out a new dominion among the Iberian tribes, conquering territory, exploiting the rich silver mines of the southeast, recruiting fierce Celtiberian warriors, building the army and the treasury that Carthage's Senate had failed to provide. Before departing, according to a tradition Polybius attributes to Hannibal himself decades later, Hamilcar led his 9-year-old son to a sacrificial altar and made him swear an oath never to be a friend of Rome. Whether the scene unfolded exactly as legend preserves it, the strategic reality behind it is documented. Hamilcar was building not merely a province, but a launch pad. Hamilcar perished in battle around 229. His son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair continued the project through diplomacy, founding New Carthage as the capital of Barcid Spain. Rome, watching uneasily, negotiated the Ebro Treaty, a line north of which Carthage agreed not to campaign. South of that river sat the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221, command passed to a 25-year-old officer whom the army acclaimed by acclamation. His name was Hannibal Barca. Within 2 years, Hannibal besieged Saguntum. The city fell after 8 months of resistance in late 219. Rome sent envoys to Carthage demanding Hannibal's surrender. The Carthaginian Senate refused. The senior Roman ambassador gathered his toga and declared he held within its folds both war and peace. Carthage could choose. The Senate chose war. Across the western Mediterranean, arsenals opened and armies began to march. But Hannibal had no intention of waiting for Rome to dictate the battlefield. He was already looking north, toward the passes of the Alps, planning a strike so audacious that no Roman strategist had imagined it possible. The army Hannibal inherited was unlike anything the ancient world had seen, not because of its size, but because of its composition. It was a coalition forged from a dozen peoples, speaking half a dozen languages, fighting in as many styles, held together not by citizenship or conscription, but by loyalty to one family and the promise of plunder. Understanding this army is essential, because everything that will happen on the road to Italy and on the plain of Cannae depends on what this force could do and how its commander wielded it. At its core stood the Libyan infantry, drawn from Carthage's North African territories. These were professional soldiers, trained in close order fighting, equipped with heavy shields and thrusting spears. Polybius regarded them as the finest foot soldiers in Hannibal's order of battle. They would prove it. Alongside them served the Spanish infantry, Celtiberians and Iberians recruited from the conquered and allied tribes of the peninsula. They carried the falcata, a curved, slashing sword of fearsome reputation, and fought with a ferocity that Roman veterans would learn to respect at terrible cost. The cavalry was Hannibal's decisive arm. Numidian horsemen from the desert south of Carthage rode without bridles, guiding their small, agile mounts with knee pressure alone, hurling javelins and wheeling away before any pursuer could close. On the heavier end, Spanish and Gallic cavalry carried lances and swords, capable of shock charges that could shatter a formed line. Hannibal understood what Roman commanders consistently undervalued, that battles in open country were decided on the wings, and whoever owned the flanks owned the field. Then there were the elephants. Polybius records 37 crossing into Italy, North African forest elephants smaller than their Indian cousins, but still terrifying to horses and men who had never faced them. Their tactical value was real but limited. They were weapons of shock and disruption, not of sustained combat. By the spring of 218, Hannibal had assembled this force at New Carthage, modern Cartagena. Polybius, citing an inscription Hannibal himself left on a bronze tablet at the Temple of Juno on Cape Licinium, records the army's strength at departure. Roughly 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and the elephant contingent. These are extraordinary numbers, and they reveal the scale of Barcid ambition. But Hannibal did not intend to take all of them to Italy. He detached roughly 13,000 infantry and over 1,000 cavalry under his brother Hasdrubal to hold Spain. He garrisoned North Africa with additional forces. The column that actually marched north from New Carthage numbered approximately 50,000 infantry and 9,000 horse, still enormous, still polyglot, still untested against Rome's legions in pitched battle. The route itself was the gamble. Rome expected the next war to be fought in Spain and Africa. 2 consular armies were being prepared, one to sail for Carthage, another to intercept Hannibal in Spain. Hannibal intended to be in none of those places. He would march overland through southern Gaul, cross the Alps before winter sealed the passes, and appear in the Po Valley, in Italy itself, before Rome understood what was happening. In late spring he crossed the Ebro River, the boundary Rome considered its sphere of influence. Hostile Iberian tribes north of the river resisted, and Hannibal spent weeks reducing them, losing men he could not replace. By the time his column reached the Pyrenees, he had already detached another 11,000 troops, some as garrisons, others dismissed because their loyalty seemed uncertain. The force that crossed into Gaul was leaner, perhaps 50,000 foot and 9,000 horse by Polybius's reckoning, though Livy gives lower figures. Every mile northward stretched his supply line thinner. There would be no reinforcement, no naval support, no safe harbor behind him. The army carried what it needed, or took what it found. Hannibal's intelligence network, scouts, merchants, Gallic emissaries he had cultivated for years, reported that certain tribes along the Rhone would resist, and others could be bought. He planned accordingly, sending gold ahead of his vanguard. The column pressed through the coastal plain of southern Gaul, covering roughly 15 miles a day, the elephants slowing the pace, the baggage train stretching for miles behind the rearguard. Somewhere ahead, beyond the river and beyond the mountains, lay the richest farmland in the Mediterranean world, and the legions that guarded it. Hannibal had staked everything on reaching that ground before Rome could concentrate against him. The Rhone was the next obstacle, and beyond it rose the Alps. The Rhone crossing itself nearly ended the campaign before the mountains ever came into view. The river ran wide and fast near its lower course, and hostile Volcae tribesmen held the far bank. Hannibal sent a detachment under Hanno, son of Bomilcar, upstream to cross undetected and circle behind the defenders. When smoke signals rose from the far bank, the main body launched its assault on improvised rafts and dugout canoes purchased from local traders. The Volca broke. The elephants crossed on enormous earth-covered platforms towed by boats, some panicking and wading the final stretch along the riverbed. The army reassembled on the eastern shore and turned north, away from the coast, away from the Roman consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, whose legions had landed at Massalia days too late to intercept. Now the Alps filled the horizon. Polybius, who later traveled the route and interviewed survivors, records that the ascent began in late October, when the first snows had already dusted the high passes. The precise path remains one of military history's great debates. The Col de Clapier, the Col du Mont-Cenis, the Col de la Traversette, each championed by scholars across centuries. Recent geological and archaeological work, including the discovery of disturbed peat deposits consistent with mass animal passage near the traversette, has shifted opinion, but certainty remains elusive. What every source agrees upon is the suffering. The column stretched for miles through narrowing valleys. Hostile mountain tribes held the high ground, rolling boulders onto the path, ambushing the baggage train at switchbacks where cavalry could not deploy. Hannibal learned to seize ridgeline positions each evening before the column halted, posting his heaviest infantry above the trail. One devastating ambush in a gorge, Polybius places it on the fourth day, cost hundreds of pack animals and an unknown number of men, the mules pitching over cliff edges under a hail of stones. The army's Gallic guides proved unreliable. Some led detachments into dead-end valleys deliberately. Higher still, the path disappeared under ice. Polybius describes a section where an old landslide had carried away the trail for roughly 300 yards. Engineers cut a new ledge into the rock face, heating boulders with fire and, according to Livy, splitting them with sour wine, a detail many historians regard as literary embellishment, though the underlying technique of thermal fracturing was known. The work took 3 days. Elephants and horses stood idle on the narrow track above, consuming fodder the army could not replace. The descent proved worse than the climb. Frozen scree gave way underfoot. Men slid hundreds of feet down icy slopes. Pack animals broke legs on concealed rocks beneath the snow and had to be abandoned. The column that had crossed the Pyrenees perhaps 5 months earlier, with roughly 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants, now stumbled onto the plains of the Po Valley as a ghost of itself. Polybius gives the surviving strength as 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and most of the elephants, losses approaching half the total force, consumed not by any Roman sword, but by cold, altitude, rockfall, starvation, and tribal resistance across 15 days of mountain passage. Yet the survivors were the hardest core of the army, men who had endured the unendurable and followed their commander through it. Hannibal rested them among friendly Gallic tribes of the Insubru and Boii, who had been promised war against Rome and now saw proof that it was coming. Fresh recruits filled some of the gaps. Horses were fed on the autumn grain of the Po Valley. Within weeks the army began to resemble a fighting force again. Rome had expected the war to be fought in Spain and Africa. Instead, an enemy army stood on Italian soil for the first time since the Gallic sack nearly 2 centuries before. The consul Scipio, having missed Hannibal at the Rhone, had sent his legions to Spain under his brother and sailed back to take command of the garrison forces in the north. 2 Roman armies now converged toward the Carthaginian position along the Ticinus River, confident that this battered invasion force could be crushed before winter. The first clash came not along the Trebia, but at the Ticinus, a smaller river west of modern Pavia. In late November, Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio led a cavalry reconnaissance in force across the stream and collided with Hannibal's Numidian and Spanish horsemen on the open plain. The engagement was brief and decisive. Roman javelin cavalry, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, broke within minutes. Scipio himself took a serious wound and was carried from the field. Tradition credits his 17-year-old son, the future Scipio Africanus, with saving his father's life, though Polybius notes this story was disputed even in antiquity. The skirmish was small, but its meaning was enormous. Hannibal's cavalry had proven its superiority in the first minutes of contact on Italian soil. Rome's answer marched north. The second consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, force-marched his legions from the Adriatic coast, burning to fight before the campaign season closed. He joined Scipio's battered force near the Trebia, a western tributary of the Po, and assumed effective command. Scipio, weakened by his wound, counseled patience, wait for winter to harden, let Hannibal's Gallic allies grow restless, force the Carthaginian to attack on Roman terms. Sempronius rejected this. He had 2 full consular armies, perhaps 40,000 men. He wanted battle. Hannibal gave him exactly what he wanted, on exactly the terms Hannibal chose. The Carthaginian identified a dry stream bed thick with brambles and brush on the Roman side of the Trebia, and placed his younger brother Mago there with 2,000 picked infantry and cavalry hidden before dawn. Then, in the frozen darkness of a December morning, Hannibal sent Numidian horsemen across the river to harass the Roman camp, throwing javelins and wheeling away. Sempronius reacted precisely as intended. He ordered his legions out immediately, before the men had eaten breakfast. The Romans waded the Trebia in water that reached their chests, the current swollen by winter rain, the cold biting through tunics and numbing hands that would need to grip swords and pila within the hour. They formed up on the western bank, shivering, hungry and soaked, facing Hannibal's line drawn up on dry ground after a warm meal. The frontage stretched roughly 3,000 paces. Hannibal placed his Gallic and Spanish infantry at center, his elephants and light troops on the flanks, and his heavy cavalry, Numidians on one wing, Spanish and Gallic horse on the other, at the extremes. The Roman legions advanced with characteristic discipline, and at center they fought well, pushing the Carthaginian infantry back through sheer mass and determination. But on the flanks, the story was different. Hannibal's cavalry swept the Roman horsemen from the field, then turned inward against the exposed sides of the legionary formation. The elephants, though some sources suggest they performed unevenly, added confusion and terror to the allied infantry on the Roman wings. Then Mago struck. His 2,000 men erupted from the streambed into the Roman rear. The legions, already pressed from 3 sides, now found enemies behind them. The wings collapsed. Thousands of allied troops broke and ran for the river. The Roman center, roughly 10,000 legionaries, cut their way straight through the Carthaginian line by sheer momentum and marched to Placentia, a testament to legionary discipline even in catastrophe. But the rest of the army disintegrated. Polybius records that most of those who fled toward the Trebia perished in the freezing water. Total Roman losses reached perhaps 20,000, with additional thousands captured. The pattern that would reach its perfection at Cannae appeared here in embryonic form, a center designed to absorb and hold the Roman advance, cavalry superiority converting into flank attacks, a concealed force striking the rear. Hannibal had read not just the terrain, but the personality of his opponent, engineering a battle that exploited Sempronius's impatience as precisely as it exploited the frozen river at his back. Rome had now lost 2 engagements in weeks. Northern Italy's Gallic tribes flocked to Hannibal's standard, swelling his ranks with fresh warriors eager for Roman spoils. The Senate dispatched new armies for the spring, electing Gaius Flaminius, a populist and a fighter, as consul for 217 before Christ. He marched north with 4 legions, determined to pin Hannibal in the Po Valley. Instead, Hannibal slipped past him through the flooded marshes of the Arno, losing men and his last surviving elephant, and emerged in Etruria between Flaminius and Rome itself. The consul turned and followed, marching fast along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene. The northern shore of Lake Trasimene runs east along a narrow strip of flat ground, hemmed between the water to the south and a chain of wooded hills rising steeply to the north. At the eastern end, the plain opens slightly near the village of Tuoro. At the western end, a defile pinches the road into a bottleneck, where the hills press close to the shore. Hannibal studied this ground on the 21st of June, 217 before Christ, and recognized it instantly for what it was, a corridor that could become a killing box. He deployed his forces with the precision of a man setting a snare. His Libyan and Spanish veterans occupied the hills along the northern ridge, concealed among trees and morning scrub. Gallic infantry held the eastern exit, blocking any forward escape. His cavalry sealed the western defile behind the Roman column once it entered. The entire army, perhaps 35,000 men, lay silent in the pre-dawn darkness, spread across nearly 4 miles of hillside, invisible from the road below. Flaminius broke camp at first light and marched his column eastward along the lake shore without sending scouts ahead into the hills. The morning mist that rose off Trasimene was unusually dense, reducing visibility to a few hundred paces. Polybius records that the fog was so thick the head of the Roman column could not see its own tail. 4 legions and allied contingents, roughly 25,000 men, stretched into a long, thin marching formation, strung out along the narrow road with the lake at their left shoulder and the hidden hills at their right. Hannibal waited until the entire column had entered the corridor. Then the signal sounded. The attack came from everywhere at once. Carthaginian forces poured down the hillsides along the full length of the Roman line, striking not a formation but a column in march. Men walking 4 or 6 abreast, shields slung, javelins bundled. There was no time to deploy into battle order. There was no space. Units could not see adjacent units through the fog. Centurions shouted orders that dissolved in the mist before reaching the next century. The Roman military system, built on precise alignment and mutual support between maniples, required room and time to form. Hannibal denied both. The fighting fragmented into dozens of isolated struggles. Some Roman cohorts managed to form rough defensive clusters and fought with desperate discipline. Others were driven into the lake, where the weight of armor dragged men under. Flaminius himself fell in the chaos. Polybius states he was killed by a band of Gallic warriors, though the exact circumstances remain uncertain. He had no chance to exercise command once the ambush closed. The destruction took roughly 3 hours. Approximately 15,000 Romans perished. Another 6,000 from the vanguard fought through the Gallic blocking force at the eastern end and escaped onto open ground, only to be surrounded and captured the following day by Hannibal's cavalry. An additional 2,000 were taken prisoner along the shore. Rome lost an entire consular army in a single morning. It remains the largest successful ambush in recorded military history, not merely in casualties, but in the completeness of surprise achieved against a professional army in the field. Hannibal accomplished it without siege equipment, without naval superiority, without numerical advantage. He used terrain, weather, patience, and his enemy's temperament. When news reached Rome, the praetor Marcus Pomponius addressed the assembled citizens with words Polybius preserves in stark simplicity. They had been defeated in a great battle. No euphemism. The Senate moved immediately to emergency measures. Quintus Fabius Maximus was appointed dictator, the first in a generation, with authority superseding both consuls. His mandate was to save the state. Fabius understood what Trasimene proved. Hannibal could not be met in open battle by any commander then living. The Carthaginian read terrain the way other generals read maps, and he read Roman aggression the way a hunter reads the habits of prey. Fabius chose the only strategy that neutralized this genius. He refused to fight. He would shadow Hannibal's army through the Italian hills, deny him battle, cut off his foragers, and let time and distance erode what Roman swords could not. The Romans called him cunctator, the delayer, and they meant it as an insult. But Fabius had looked at the mathematics of Trebia and Trasimene and drawn the only rational conclusion. The legions needed a new kind of war. Whether Rome's Senate would tolerate that patience was another question entirely, and already the voices demanding a decisive blow were growing louder in the forum. Fabius understood something that most of Rome's political class could not accept, that the Republic's greatest strength, its inexhaustible reserves of citizen soldiers, was meaningless if those soldiers kept marching into traps designed by a mind that had not yet made a single tactical error. His strategy was elegant in its simplicity and maddening in its demands. He kept 4 legions within striking distance of Hannibal's army, always on higher ground, always refusing the open plains where Carthaginian cavalry could operate freely. When Hannibal moved south into Campania, Fabius followed along the ridgelines. When Hannibal's foragers spread across the rich farmland, Roman detachments struck at isolated parties and vanished. The Carthaginian army was eating well but bleeding slowly, losing dozens of men each week to skirmishes it could never force into a general engagement. The strategy was working, and Rome despised it. Polybius records the political fury with precision. Senators whose estates Hannibal was burning demanded action. The allied Italian communities, watching Carthaginian columns march unopposed through their fields, began questioning whether Rome could protect them at all. Fabius's own master of horse, Marcus Minucius Rufus, openly criticized the dictator's caution, and the popular assemblies took the extraordinary step of elevating Minucius to equal command, a constitutional act without precedent, splitting dictatorial authority in 2. Minucius promptly demonstrated why Fabius had been right. Near Geronium, in the autumn of 217, Minucius engaged what appeared to be an exposed Carthaginian foraging force. Hannibal had anticipated exactly this aggression. Concealed detachments rose from dead ground on both flanks. Minucius's legions found themselves pressed from 3 sides on terrain that offered no anchor. Only Fabius's rapid advance with his own divisions prevented a third catastrophe. Minucius, to his credit, acknowledged the rescue and voluntarily returned to subordinate command. But the political damage was done. Rome's leadership had tasted the Fabian method for 6 months and found it intolerable. When Fabius's 6-month dictatorial term expired in the winter of 217 to 216, the Senate chose not to renew it. The elections that followed reflected the national mood perfectly. Gaius Terentius Varro, a man Polybius portrays as aggressive and politically ambitious, won the consulship on an explicit promise to end the war in a single day of battle. His colleague Lucius Aemilius Paullus was more cautious, experienced, and deeply skeptical of forcing an engagement on Hannibal's terms. The Republic yoked these two temperaments together under the traditional system of alternating daily command, a mechanism designed for civic balance, not battlefield coherence. Through the spring of 216, Rome assembled the largest field army in its history. 8 full legions with their paired allied formations, perhaps 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, concentrated in Apulia. The logistical effort alone was staggering. Grain convoys from Sicily, arms production across Latium, draft animals requisitioned from every allied community. The sheer mass of this force was itself the strategy. Rome would present Hannibal with a wall of heavy infantry so deep, so dense, that no tactical cleverness could prevent it from grinding forward through anything in its path. Paullus reportedly warned that the terrain mattered more than the numbers. Flat, open ground near rivers would cage the legions and liberate Hannibal's 10,000 horsemen. The warning went unheeded. When Hannibal seized the Roman supply depot at the hilltop town of Cannae on the Aufidus River in late July, he was not merely raiding grain. He was choosing the battlefield, a broad, treeless plain where cavalry could sweep without obstruction and where the river itself would guard one flank while compressing the other. The bait was irresistible. Rome's enormous army turned south to recover its supplies and destroy the Carthaginian force once and for all. Column after column filled the Apulian roads, raising dust visible for miles, marching toward a plain that Hannibal had already measured, studied, and prepared to transform into a killing ground shaped like a closing fist. The scale of what Rome attempted in the spring of 216 before Christ had no precedent in the Republic's history. The Senate authorized the raising of 8 full legions, double the normal wartime establishment, and demanded that each allied community in the Italian Confederation furnish its matching contingent of infantry and cavalry. Polybius records the total force at roughly 80,000 foot soldiers and 6,000 horsemen, though Livy pushes the infantry figure closer to 87,000. Even the lower estimate represented the largest single army Rome had ever placed under unified command, a mass of armed men that would stretch more than 12 miles on the march and require over 200,000 pounds of grain each day simply to remain fed. The legions themselves were not identical to those that had perished at Trebia and Trasimene. Many of the veterans who understood Hannibal's methods were already in the ground. The new formations drew heavily on men who had never faced Carthaginian cavalry at speed. Farmers from Latium, tradesmen from Campania, young equestrians serving their mandatory 10 campaigns. Training proceeded through the winter and early spring at assembly points across central Italy. Recruits drilled the standard sequence: javelin throw at 15 to 20 paces, then close with the gladius behind the heavy scutum shield. Each legionary carried 2 pila, the heavier version weighing perhaps 4 pounds with its soft iron shank designed to bend on impact and render an enemy shield useless. The system was proven, devastating at close quarters, and entirely dependent on one assumption, that the legion would always have room to fight. This was the structural flaw no amount of drilling could remedy. Rome's tactical doctrine required open flanks for maneuver, space for the triplex aces formation to rotate its 3 lines of hastati, principes, and triarii. But the Senate's solution to Hannibal was not tactical innovation. It was multiplication. More legions, deeper formations, heavier mass. The consuls were instructed to seek battle and overwhelm the Carthaginian line by sheer frontal pressure. The depth of the Roman formation at Cannae would eventually reach an extraordinary 70 or more ranks, a column so dense that men in the rear could not reach the enemy, and men in the front could not step backward. Command of this colossus fell to two consuls of radically different temperament. Lucius Aemilius Paullus, elected with patrician support, had fought in Illyria and understood that open, flat terrain near rivers favored Hannibal's superior cavalry. Gaius Terentius Varro, a political outsider backed by the popular assembly, believed the previous defeats resulted from timidity rather than tactical error. Under Roman law, both consuls held equal imperium over the combined army, alternating supreme command on successive days. Polybius is explicit that this rotation was not merely ceremonial. The consul in command on any given day held full authority over deployment, march order, and the decision to offer or refuse battle. The tension between these two men mirrored the tension within Rome itself. One consul saw the army's size as a guarantee of victory through direct assault. The other saw it as a liability on the wrong ground, a herd too large to maneuver, too slow to react, too deep to use its weapons. Both were correct about different halves of the same problem, and neither could overrule the other for more than 24 hours at a time. By midsummer, the army was complete, provisioned, and marching south through Apulia in a column that consumed the roads. Dust marked its passage like smoke from a slow fire. Ahead, beside the Aufidus, Hannibal waited with fewer than 50,000 men, his Numidian scouts already counting the Roman standards as they appeared over the horizon, reporting the spacing of the columns, the position of the cavalry on the flanks, the depth of the infantry blocks. Everything he saw confirmed what he had prepared for. The largest army Rome had ever built was walking toward him in exactly the formation he needed it to hold. The army camped along the Aufidus was unlike anything the ancient world had assembled under a single command. It was not a national force. It had no common language, no shared gods, no single tradition of war. It was a coalition of professionals, mercenaries, tribal warriors, and veterans bound together not by citizenship, but by the will and intelligence of one man. That this instrument held together across 2 years of campaigning in hostile territory, winning 3 major engagements without a single mutiny or mass desertion, remains one of the most remarkable feats of command in military history. Hannibal's total strength near Cannae numbered roughly 50,000, composed of approximately 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. Polybius, who had access to Carthaginian records and interviewed survivors, provides the most reliable figures. The infantry divided into 3 distinct blocks, each fighting in its own style with its own weapons. The Gallic contingent, drawn from the Cisalpine tribes who had joined after the Trebia, fought stripped to the waist in the Celtic fashion, carrying long slashing swords and tall wooden shields. They were ferocious on the charge, but lacked the discipline for sustained close order fighting. The Spanish infantry carried the falcata, a heavy curved blade designed for chopping at close range, and fought behind small round shields called chitrae. Both groups excelled in aggressive forward combat, but could not match Roman legionaries in the grinding attrition of a locked shield line. Hannibal knew this precisely. He would use their courage and their expendability together. The Libyan veterans were the army's backbone. Many had served under Hamilcar in Spain. They carried long thrusting spears and heavy oval shields, and after Trebia and Trasimene, Hannibal had re-equipped many of them with captured Roman mail and scuta. Polybius notes this detail specifically. These men could fight in close formation, indistinguishable from a Roman battle line. They were held back from the opening clashes of every major engagement, preserved for the decisive moment. The cavalry comprised two forces of entirely different character. On the left wing, Hasdrubal commanded roughly 6,500 heavy horsemen, a mix of Spanish and Gallic riders equipped with helmets, mail, and heavy javelins. On the right, Mahabal led approximately 3,500 Numidian light cavalry, unarmored riders on small, fast horses who fought with javelins and could wheel, scatter, and reform faster than any mounted force in the Mediterranean world. Together they outnumbered Roman and allied cavalry by nearly 2-to-1, a ratio that would prove decisive. What unified these disparate elements was Hannibal's command structure. His senior officers, Hasdrubal, Mahabal, his brother Mago, had served with him for years. Orders passed through interpreters where necessary, but the tactical system relied less on complex battlefield commands than on prearranged roles rehearsed before engagement. Each unit knew its task. The Gauls and Spaniards knew they would absorb the first shock. The Libyans knew they would wait. The cavalry knew it must win its fight quickly and return. Intelligence completed the system. Numidian scouts operated in a screen miles ahead of the main body, reporting Roman movements, foraging patterns, and camp locations. Hannibal consistently knew more about his enemy's dispositions than the Roman consuls knew about his. He understood the alternating command, the tension between Paullus and Varro, the depth of the Roman formation. His agents moved among Italian communities, gathering information and probing allied loyalty. Camp discipline held this polyglot force together through the Italian summer. Rations were distributed equitably. Hannibal shared the conditions of his men, sleeping on the ground among the outposts according to multiple sources. Trust flowed from visible competence and shared hardship, not from institutional loyalty. As the Roman dust cloud grew larger on the northern horizon, Hannibal's officers completed their preparations. The ground beside the Aufidus had been studied, the wind patterns noted, the deployment positions marked. Every element of this composite army had a precise role in a design that existed, for now, only in the mind of its commander. The Romans were bringing mass. Hannibal intended to give that mass exactly the victory it craved, a deep, irresistible push forward into the center of his line, and then to make that very success the instrument of annihilation. The Roman dust cloud was no longer a smudge on the horizon. It was a wall of ochre haze stretching across the Apulian plain, visible for miles, raised by the feet of the largest army the Republic had ever marched south. Somewhere beneath that pall moved 86,000 men, 16 legions worth of infantry and cavalry, their baggage trains snaking behind them along roads that had never carried such weight. The consuls Paullus and Varro led this colossus southeast through the baking landscape of northern Apulia, alternating command each day as constitutional tradition demanded, a rotation that meant the army's strategic personality changed with every sunrise. Hannibal moved first. In late June or early July, he broke camp and marched southeast to seize the fortified supply depot at Cannae, a ruined citadel perched on a low rise above the south bank of the Aufidus River. The depot held grain stores that Rome had accumulated for its advancing army. Its capture accomplished two things simultaneously. It fed Hannibal's troops, and it forced the Romans to follow him onto ground of his choosing. Polybius records that the seizure of Cannae caused something close to panic in the Roman camp, not merely for the lost supplies, but because Hannibal now controlled the surrounding countryside, and foraging had become dangerous. The Roman army followed, as it had to. The consuls marched their enormous column roughly 75 miles southeast across the dry Apulian plateau, arriving within 6 miles of Hannibal's position near the Aufidus. Paullus, commanding on the day the army reached the area, immediately recognized the problem. The terrain around Cannae was flat, open, and treeless, a cavalry plain. Every advantage belonged to Hannibal's 10,000 horsemen against Rome's 6,000. Paullus argued for drawing the Carthaginians onto rougher ground where Roman infantry mass could fight without fear of envelopment. Polybius preserves his objection clearly. The consul believed that waiting a few days would force Hannibal to move, since his army consumed its captured stores rapidly and could not remain stationary indefinitely. But the next dawn brought Varro's turn to command. The political dynamic that had driven Rome to reject Fabius's caution now operated at the tactical level. Varro advanced the army closer, establishing 2 camps, a larger one on the west bank of the Aufidus and a smaller fortified position across the river on the east bank, designed to protect foraging parties. The distance between the Roman camps and Hannibal's position shrank to perhaps 4 miles. Skirmishing began almost immediately. Numidian cavalry harassed Roman water parties along the river. Hannibal sent light troops to probe the larger camp's defenses, testing Roman reactions, gauging the depth of their formations, reading the temperament of whoever held command that particular morning. Each probe confirmed what his scouts had already reported. The Romans intended to fight on the open plain, trusting their unprecedented infantry mass to overwhelm anything in its path. The Aufidus itself became the silent architect of the coming engagement. The river ran roughly northwest to southeast through the plain, its summer flow reduced, but its banks still defining the geometry of any deployment. An army formed with its flank against the river could not be turned on that side, but neither could it retreat across the water if things went wrong. For Hannibal, the river was a wall he could use. For the Romans, it would become a cage they did not yet recognize. The days of late July passed in rising heat and tension. The sirocco wind, the Volturnus, blew from the south and southeast, carrying fine Apulian dust into the faces of anyone facing that direction. Hannibal noted this. He noted everything. The width of usable ground between the river and the rising terrain to the south, the angles at which cavalry could wheel, the distance his Libyan veterans would need to march before pivoting inward. Paullus continued to resist engagement on this ground, but constitutional command rotated with the sun, and on the morning of August 1st, Varro ordered the army to prepare for battle the following day. The largest Roman force ever assembled would deploy on a plain that nullified its greatest advantage and magnified its most dangerous weakness. The trap Hannibal had been constructing since he seized the grain depot was nearly complete. All that remained was for Rome to walk into it. Varro's order rippled through the camp before the sun cleared the eastern hills. 80,000 men would fight tomorrow. But first they had to be placed, and the ground they would stand on had already been chosen, not by Rome, but by the man camped across the river. The plain of Cannae stretches roughly 4 miles along the south bank of the Aufidus, a shallow, slow-moving river that in August runs barely knee-deep in most places, but whose steep, muddy banks and soft bed make it a serious obstacle for any formation trying to cross under pressure. To the south, the ground rises gently toward low ridges and the ruins of the old citadel Hannibal had seized weeks earlier. Between river and ridge, the usable frontage narrows to perhaps 2 miles, wide enough for a large army to deploy, but not wide enough for the largest army Rome had ever assembled to use its numbers as it wished. This was the cage. Polybius is explicit. The river anchored the Roman right, preventing any outflanking maneuver on that side, but also denying the Roman cavalry room to extend. The rising ground compressed the left. The Roman mass, which should have been its hammer, would be squeezed into a corridor where depth replaced width, and depth against an enemy planning encirclement meant only more men packed into the killing ground. Paullus had seen this. His objections are recorded. The flat, open terrain favored cavalry, and Hannibal held nearly 10,000 horsemen against Rome's 6,000. On broken or hilly ground, Roman infantry superiority would tell. On this plain, it invited disaster. But command had rotated. Varro held authority on August 1st, and Varro believed what the Senate believed, that the sheer mass of 8 legions striking in a deep, narrow column would punch through any center and split the Carthaginian army in 2. The Roman deployment plan reflected this conviction. Rather than the standard formation with manipular intervals allowing flexibility, the tribunes received orders to compress the gaps between maniples and deepen the lines. Polybius records that the maniples were drawn up with greater depth than frontage, a deliberate choice to concentrate striking power at the point of contact. Each maniple became a battering ram rather than a flexible tactical unit. The velites would screen forward as usual, the hastati forming the first heavy line, the principes behind, the triarii in reserve, but all packed tighter than doctrine prescribed. The Roman and allied cavalry split to the wings, roughly 2,400 citizen cavalry on the right near the river under Paullus, and perhaps 3,600 allied horse on the left under Varro. Across the plain, Hannibal held his last council. His plan required nerve that bordered on madness. He would place his least reliable infantry, the Gauls and Spaniards, perhaps 16,000 men, at the center, pushed forward in a convex arc bulging toward the Romans. These men would absorb the full weight of the Roman advance. They were meant to bend. They were meant to fall back. What they must not do was break entirely. Behind and to either side, echeloned back at oblique angles, stood the Libyan heavy infantry, veterans armed with captured Roman equipment, perhaps 12,000 in 2 columns. These men would not engage at first. They would wait, motionless, while the center sagged inward and the Roman mass funneled deeper into the pocket. Then they would wheel inward, striking the Roman flanks from both sides simultaneously. The cavalry held the key to the lock. On the left wing, nearest the river, Hasdrubal commanded roughly 6,500 heavy Gallic and Spanish horsemen against the 2,400 Roman cavalry opposite. On the right, Hanno led approximately 3,500 Numidian light cavalry against Varro's allied horse. The Numidians would skirmish, pin, and delay. Hasdrubal would destroy. The hot wind called the Volturnus would blow from the southeast at mid-morning, driving dust directly into Roman faces. Hannibal positioned his line to keep the wind at his soldiers' backs. It was a detail. It was also the difference between men who could see and men who fought half-blind. As the sun set on August 1st, both armies knew what dawn would bring. In the Roman camp, soldiers checked the edges of their gladi and tightened the leather bindings of their scooter. Across the river, Hannibal's officers walked the lines one final time, confirming that every contingent understood its role in a choreography no army had ever attempted at this scale. The geometry was set. The river waited on one side, the hills on the other, and between them, a corridor designed to swallow an empire's finest army whole. Dawn came to the Aufidus Plain on August 2nd, 216 before Christ, and with it the sound of 80,000 men forming ranks. The Roman infantry deployed in an unusually deep formation, maniples stacked closer than standard doctrine prescribed. The intervals between units narrowed to maximize the crushing weight of the advance. Varro wanted a battering ram, not a flexible line. The depth of the Roman center may have reached 36 ranks in places, perhaps more. It was a formation designed to punch through any opposition by sheer mass. It was also a formation that sacrificed the lateral mobility, which had always been the legion's signature advantage. On the Roman right, nearest the river, Consul Aemilius Paullus commanded roughly 2,400 Roman citizen cavalry. Across from them, Hasdrubal, not Hannibal's brother but his trusted cavalry officer, marshaled approximately 6,500 heavy horsemen, a mix of Spanish and Gallic riders on larger mounts, armed with long swords and javelins. The disparity was nearly 3-to-1. On the opposite flank, the Roman allied cavalry numbered perhaps 3,600, facing Hanno's Numidian light horse. The river anchored the Roman right, preventing any wide flanking maneuver, but it also compressed the cavalry engagement into a narrow corridor, where numbers would decide everything quickly. The battle opened on the wings. Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry charged the Roman right with devastating directness. There was no skirmishing phase, no cautious probing. Polybius records that the engagement was barbaric in its intensity, with riders dismounting to fight on foot when the press became too tight for horses to maneuver. The Roman citizen cavalry, outnumbered and outmatched, broke within minutes. Paullus, already struck by a sling stone early in the engagement, fought on with the infantry. His cavalry wing simply ceased to exist as a fighting force, its remnants streaming along the riverbank. Meanwhile, at center, the Roman legions stepped forward into the convex bulge of Gallic and Spanish infantry that Hannibal had placed as his front line. These men, bare-chested Gauls with long slashing swords, Spaniards with short stabbing blades, were brave but lightly equipped compared to the legionaries pressing against them. The bulge began to flatten. Then it began to bend inward. Step by step, the Roman mass pushed the Carthaginian center back, exactly as every Roman officer expected. The legions were winning. The geometry was confirming everything Varro had promised the Senate. But the geometry was a lie. The deeper the Romans advanced, the more their formation compressed laterally between the two echeloned columns of Libyan heavy infantry that Hannibal had held back on each side of his center. These Libyans stood motionless, equipped with captured Roman armor and weapons from Trebia and Trasimene, watching the legions funnel past them like water pouring into a narrowing channel. The Roman officers driving the advance could see only the retreating enemy ahead. The dust, now thickened by the Volturnus wind blowing directly into Roman faces, obscured the flanks. On the far wing, Hanno's Numidians engaged the allied cavalry in a swirling, indecisive fight, pinning them in place, preventing any redeployment. Hasdrubal, having destroyed the Roman right, did not pursue the fleeing horsemen. Instead, he wheeled his entire force behind the Roman infantry line and rode for the opposite flank, a maneuver covering nearly 2 miles of active battlefield. It was a decision that required extraordinary discipline from cavalry that had just won a violent engagement, and it revealed the depth of training and trust within Hannibal's command structure. The Roman center continued to advance. The concavity deepened. Somewhere in the swirling dust, the Libyan veterans received their signal and began to dress their ranks, preparing to pivot inward against the exposed Roman flanks. The legions, packed so tightly that rear ranks could barely lift their arms, pressed forward into what felt like victory. The Libyan columns had stood in their echeloned positions for nearly an hour, watching the Roman mass grind past them on both sides. 8,000 veterans on the left, 8,000 on the right. Polybius is specific about their placement, dressed in captured Roman armor stripped from the fallen at Trebia and Trasimene. They carried long thrusting spears and heavy shields, and they had not yet taken a single step forward. That stillness was the most dangerous thing on the field. The signal came, whether by trumpet, by runner, or by Hannibal's own presence riding behind the line, the sources do not say. What they do record is the movement itself. The Libyan columns on each flank executed a quarter wheel inward, pivoting on their inside files like doors swinging shut on massive hinges. The maneuver required each man to maintain his interval while changing the axis of his entire formation by 90 degrees, closing obliquely against the exposed flanks of the Roman infantry mass. It was a drill ground evolution performed in dust and noise on a battlefield already shaking with the compression of tens of thousands of men, and it was carried out with a precision that Polybius, writing decades later with access to eyewitnesses from both sides, still describes with something close to awe. The Romans on the outer files of the advancing legions suddenly found armed men striking into their unshielded right sides. The legionary scutum protected the left. A blow from the right found only the sword arm and the exposed ribs. But the deeper catastrophe was geometric, not tactical. The Roman formation was now being pressed from 3 directions, the Gallic and Spanish survivors still holding at center, however thinly, and the Libyan veterans driving into both flanks. The enormous depth that the consuls had chosen as their instrument of breakthrough now became a cage. Rear ranks could not turn to face the new threat. Middle ranks could not disengage from the men ahead of them. The entire mass began to lose its articulation, its ability to function as organized maniples, and started compressing into a formless crowd. And then Hasdrubal arrived. His circuit of the battlefield had covered roughly 3,000 paces behind the Roman rear, riding from the river flank to the open flank, where the Numidian light cavalry under Hanno had been skirmishing with Rome's allied horsemen. The Numidians had not attempted to break the allied cavalry. They had pinned them, harassed them, kept them engaged without decisive result. Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry now struck the allied horse from behind. The collapse was immediate. The allied cavalry scattered into the Apulian countryside, and the Numidians peeled off to pursue, ensuring no mounted Roman force remained on the field. Hasdrubal then reformed his squadrons, a feat of command that speaks to months of shared training between Iberian and Gallic riders, and drove them directly into the rear of the Roman infantry mass. The fourth side of the trap closed. The encirclement was complete. Somewhere between 70 and 80,000 Roman and allied soldiers now stood inside a contracting ring of Carthaginian arms, pressed so tightly together that Polybius records men unable to raise their weapons. The formation that was supposed to punch through Hannibal's center like a battering ram had instead been swallowed whole by it. Every advantage Rome had brought to the field, superior numbers, heavier infantry, deeper formations, had been turned into a liability by the geometry of a single afternoon. Standards began to fall. Centurions who tried to organize local resistance found themselves surrounded before they could form a line. The consul Paullus, already carrying a wound from a sling stone received during the cavalry phase, was somewhere in the compressed mass on the Roman right, still mounted, still attempting to rally men who could no longer maneuver. The dust was so thick that men in the center of the Roman formation could not see the edges of their own army. They could only feel the pressure increasing from every direction, the space between shoulders shrinking, the terrible awareness that no order was coming because no order could reach them. Hannibal had wagered everything on a single proposition, that Rome's strength, properly channeled, would destroy itself. The Libyan wheel and Hasdrubal's rear stroke were the closing arguments. The afternoon sun climbed toward its zenith over the Aufidus plain, and beneath it the largest army the Roman Republic had ever assembled stood locked inside a ring of spears with no avenue of retreat and no room to fight. The ring of spears tightened through the early afternoon, and with each passing quarter hour the geometry of annihilation grew more absolute. Polybius, writing with access to survivors from both sides, describes what happened next, not as a battle, but as a systematic compression. Tens of thousands of men pressed so tightly together that they could no longer raise their arms to strike. The Roman short sword, the gladius, required roughly 2 feet of clearance to thrust effectively. In formations packed shoulder to shoulder at normal density, each legionary occupied a frontage of about 3 feet. Now that space shrank to less than 18 inches. Shields locked against the backs of the men ahead. Arms pinned against ribs. The weapon that had conquered Italy became a useless weight in a paralyzed hand. The Carthaginian perimeter worked inward with methodical patience. The Libyan veterans on both flanks maintained their formation discipline, presenting a wall of long spears and overlapping shields that the outermost Romans could neither penetrate nor escape. From the rear, Hasdrubal's cavalry, dismounted now, according to several ancient accounts, because horsemen could not efficiently operate against a compressed infantry mass, added a fourth wall to the enclosure. The Numidians under Hannibal swept the surrounding plain, running down the scattered groups that had broken free in the first moments before the ring sealed completely. Inside the pocket, command structure dissolved. Consul Lucius Aemilius Paullus, already carrying a wound from a sling stone received during the cavalry engagement that morning, remained somewhere in the press. Polybius records that he continued to fight on foot after losing his horse, surrounded by a diminishing knot of equestrians. He fell during the afternoon, the sources agree on this much, though the exact hour and manner are unrecorded. With his death, the last senior officer capable of ordering a coordinated breakout was gone. Consul Gaius Terentius Varro, commanding from the allied cavalry wing on the left, had been swept from the field when the Numidians routed his horsemen earlier. He survived with a small escort, eventually reaching Venusia with perhaps 70 cavalry. His survival would become a political fact of enormous consequence in the weeks ahead. The killing continued until the sun dropped low enough to cast long shadows across the Aufidus plain. Livy places the Roman and allied dead at nearly 70,000. Polybius, generally considered the more careful source, gives a figure closer to 50,000 infantry and several thousand cavalry. Both numbers are staggering. Among the fallen were 29 of the 48 military tribunes, 80 men of senatorial rank, and an unknown number of equestrians whose gold rings, the mark of their social class, would be collected by Carthaginian soldiers after the fighting ended. Hannibal's own losses were remarkably light by comparison. Roughly 5,500 killed, the majority from the Gallic and Spanish centre that had absorbed the full force of the Roman advance and held just long enough for the trap to close. By evening the plain fell silent. Approximately 14,000 Romans had escaped, some to the larger camp, some to the smaller camp across the river, some scattering into the countryside toward Canusium. The rest lay on the field in a compressed area that modern archaeological surveys near the village of San Ferdinando di Puglia suggest may have covered no more than 1 square mile. The density implied by those numbers remains almost incomprehensible. 50,000 men fallen within a space a person could walk across in 15 minutes. Hannibal rode the perimeter as darkness gathered. His polyglot army, Numidians, Libyans, Gauls, Spaniards, Balearic slingers, had executed the most complete tactical envelopment in recorded military history. Every element had performed its assigned function at the assigned moment. The cavalry had cleared the flanks, the centre had bent without breaking, the Libyan columns had wheeled with parade ground precision, the rear had closed like a gate. Yet even as his officers began tallying the captured supplies and the Roman camps prepared for surrender negotiations the following morning, the strategic question that would define the next 14 years of war was already forming. Hannibal pressed for an immediate march on Rome, 400 miles to the northwest. The city's walls were lightly garrisoned. Its field army had ceased to exist. Hannibal declined. His reasons are debated across 23 centuries of military scholarship, but the decision held. The army rested on the field it had won, and somewhere beyond the Apennines, Rome began to count its sons. The count began at dawn on August 3rd. Hannibal's officers moved through the field in organized parties, cataloguing what the Republic had lost in a single afternoon. The numbers defied belief. Polybius records approximately 50,000 Roman and allied dead. Livy raises the figure closer to 70,000. Modern scholarship generally accepts a range between 48 and 55,000, though certainty is impossible when the victors themselves struggled to comprehend the scale. Among the fallen lay the consul Lucius Aemilius Paullus, 29 of 48 military tribunes, 80 men of senatorial rank, and an estimated quarter of Rome's entire governing class. The other consul, Gaius Terentius Varro, had escaped with perhaps 14,000 survivors, many of them wounded, scattered across the Apulian countryside, in fragments too disorganized to constitute a fighting force. Livy preserves the tradition that Hannibal's men collected gold rings from the hands of fallen Roman equestrians, the knight class who wore them as marks of rank, and shipped them to Carthage in bushel measures. The rings were poured onto the floor of the Carthaginian Senate as proof of victory. Whether the detail is literal or embellished, its purpose was unmistakable. The military aristocracy of Rome had been physically removed from the earth. Mahabal's famous rebuke, that Hannibal knew how to win a victory, but not how to use one, appears in Livy, but not in Polybius, and many historians treat it as a later literary invention designed to explain the war's eventual outcome. Yet the strategic question it frames was real. Rome lay 400 miles northwest. Its walls were ancient but intact, its garrison skeletal. Hannibal's army, though victorious, had suffered perhaps 6,000 dead, mostly among the Gallic and Spanish center that had absorbed the Roman advance. His supply lines stretched back to no secure base. His siege train was non-existent. A march on Rome meant gambling everything on a city opening its gates in panic. Hannibal chose a different path. He released Italian allied prisoners without ransom while holding Roman citizens for payment, a calculated political weapon designed to fracture the confederation that gave Rome its manpower. The strategy bore immediate fruit. Within weeks of Cannae, much of southern Italy shifted allegiance. Capua, the second city of the peninsula, opened its gates to Hannibal in autumn, offering him a wealthy urban base. Arpi, Salapia, and several communities in Lucania and Bruttium followed. The Greek cities of the south wavered. Syracuse would soon revolt. Philip V of Macedon began negotiating an alliance with Carthage, threatening Rome with a second front across the Adriatic. Yet Rome's response revealed something Hannibal had not fully measured. The Senate refused to receive his peace embassy. It refused to ransom prisoners. It declared a period of mourning limited to 30 days, then returned to the business of war. The Republic began enrolling freedmen, debtors, and boys of 17. It purchased 8,000 slaves, armed them, and formed them into legions. Property qualifications for military service were lowered. Within months, new formations were drilling on the Campus Martius. The manpower reserves of the Italian Confederation, those allies who remained loyal, particularly the Latin colonies, proved deeper than any single battlefield could drain. The Senate appointed Marcus Junius Pyrrha as dictator and turned to the strategy that Fabius Maximus had advocated before Cannae. Avoid pitched battle, shadow Hannibal's movements, recapture defecting cities one by one, and let time and logistics erode what tactical brilliance had built. The war would no longer be decided in an afternoon. It would be decided across years, across the hills and harbors of Italy, Spain, and eventually Africa itself. On the quiet Apulian plain, the unburied dead of Cannae lay where they had fallen. Hannibal's army occupied the captured Roman camps, inventoried the seized grain and silver, and prepared to receive the embassies of Italy's wavering cities. The greatest tactical victory in the history of ancient warfare was complete. But the war it was meant to end had only changed shape, and somewhere in Rome, a 17-year-old survivor of the battle named Publius Cornelius Scipio was watching his city refuse to die. That 17-year-old survivor carried the lesson of Cannae, not as trauma, but as curriculum. Publius Cornelius Scipio spent the next decade studying what Hannibal had done, not merely the double envelopment, but the deeper architecture. How cavalry decided the flanks before infantry decided the center, how a weaker force could dictate the geometry of contact, how deception and timing could multiply numbers that did not exist. By 202 before Christ, Scipio stood on the plain of Zama in North Africa, with roughly 34,000 infantry and perhaps 6,000 cavalry, facing Hannibal himself, who had been recalled from Italy with an army of similar size but inferior horsemen. Scipio reversed the equation of Cannae with surgical precision. He arranged his maniples in columns rather than the traditional checkerboard, creating lanes through which Hannibal's 80 war elephants charged harmlessly. His Numidian cavalry under Massinissa, the same breed of horsemen who had sealed the encirclement at Cannae, routed Hannibal's wings and circled behind the Carthaginian rear. The master of the double envelopment was himself enveloped. Carthage sued for peace. The Second Punic War ended, and Rome's dominion over the western Mediterranean became irreversible. Hannibal survived Zama. He served as suffete of Carthage, reformed its finances, then fled Roman diplomatic pressure to the courts of Syria and Bithynia. Around 183 before Christ, cornered by Roman agents at the court of King Prusias, he took poison rather than surrender. Livy records his reported final words as a bitter reflection on Rome's inability to wait for an old man to die. The exact location of his tomb remains disputed. A site near Gebze in modern Turkey carries the tradition, though archaeology has not confirmed it. The battle itself passed into military scripture. Polybius, writing within living memory, provided the analytical framework that made Cannae comprehensible as system rather than miracle. Livy added the dramatic texture, the rings, Mahabal's rebuke, the Senate's defiance, that gave the story its emotional permanence. Whether Mahabal truly spoke those words remains unverifiable. The anecdote appears first in Livy, not in Polybius, and may represent later Roman narrative-making designed to explain why Hannibal failed to march on the capital. The tactical legacy proved more durable than any anecdote. In 1909, Count Alfred von Schlieffen, chief of the German Imperial General Staff, published a study titled simply Cannae, arguing that the double envelopment represented the ideal form of battle. His war plan for a future European conflict sought to replicate Hannibal's geometry at continental scale, a massive wheeling right wing through Belgium designed to encircle the French army against its own fortifications. The plan failed in 1914, undone by distances, logistics, and an enemy who refused to stand still, proving that what worked on a 3-kilometer Apulian plain could not simply be scaled to 600 kilometers of front. Yet the principle endured. In 1991, coalition forces under General Norman Schwarzkopf executed a sweeping left hook through the Iraqi desert that American planners explicitly compared to Hannibal's cavalry circuit, fixing the enemy frontally while the decisive blow fell on the flank and rear. Military academies from West Point to Sandhurst to Saint-Cyr continue to teach Cannae as the foundational case study in the art of encirclement. Modern archaeology has begun to ground the legend in physical evidence. Surveys of the Aufidus Plain near the modern village of San Ferdinando di Puglia have recovered concentrations of iron weapon fragments and bronze fittings, consistent with a large-scale engagement, though precise identification of the battlefield remains debated among scholars. What the soil confirms is simpler than what the sources claim. A great many men fought and fell in this landscape, and the earth still holds what they carried. The quiet Apulian plain today grows wheat and olives, where 80,000 Romans once marched into a trap designed by a man who understood that an army's greatest strength, its mass, its depth, its sheer weight of numbers, could be turned into its most lethal weakness. That insight, born on a single August afternoon, has never stopped being true. Thank you for joining this journey through one of history's most extraordinary battles. If this series has deepened your understanding of the ancient world, Consider subscribing so you never miss a new documentary when it arrives.